Blue Cross and Blue Shield companies formed out of a need to provide affordable health care to teachers, loggers, and miners. We are now celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Blues, developing the National Labor Office to strengthen its commitment to organized labor. Blue Cross Blue Shield's National Labor Office remains focused on America's workers, advocating for affordable and equitable health care, partnering with strategic alliances to provide industry-leading products and services, and proudly serving more than 18 million unionized workers, retirees, and their families. Working hard for America's working families, for the health of America. Learn more by following them at Blue Labor on LinkedIn and X, formerly known as Twitter. And don't forget, you can check us out on Facebook or follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. That would be AWF Union Podcast, AWF Union Podcast. One of the unions that has a long and storied history is the Longshoremen's Union. A lot of militancy, and like I said, a lot of history, especially when they went on strike back in the early 70s. Our featured guest today, and this is all on behalf of Labor 131, where we celebrate the 131st anniversary of Labor Day. Jesse Halvorsen is joining us. Jesse, I'm reading you're an independent scholar. Explain to me what that means, independent scholar.
Sure. It means I have no formal university administration, but I'm currently on the job market. That's basically
on the job market. Okay, you're on the job market.
On the job
a little
market.
Bit more on your background. You're from the Midwest. You found your way to California. Anything else you want to add to that?
As you mentioned, I completed my dissertation in 2022. In 2023, I won the Herbert Gutman Prize for Outstanding Dissertation from the Labor and Working Class History Association, otherwise known as LACHA. And my manuscript, which is basically my dissertation refashioned as a manuscript, is under contract with the University of Illinois Press for their Working Class and American History series.
Good. Well, you're a perfect fit for our segment today. So let's talk about the longshoremen.
Sure.
And their history. Where do you want to start? I'm just going to turn it over to you.
Sure. What I wanted to talk most about today is the Mechanization and Modernization Agreement of 1960. This is a landmark collective bargaining agreement between the longshoremen on the West Coast, the ILWU, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, and the PMA, the Pacific Maritime Association, the organization that represents and bargains on behalf of ship owners and stevedore contractors. And there's two major parts to this collective bargaining agreement. One is the mechanization part, basically automation, which it is shorthand for containerization and longshoring. So like the use of the shipping container in longshoring, basically. And then the modernization part of the agreement was basically modernizing so-called inefficient work rules and practices. Now, these were established mostly during the 1930s at the union's height of their militancy, and they basically secured sling load limits, which are limits on the weight that a sling load can be that's coming out of the hatch of the ship. They had manning requirements, basically the number of longshore workers on any particular longshore gang.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was another work rule that was important that was a particular thorn in the PMA side, which is called first place of rest. That's what the union called it. The employers called it double handling. Basically, it demarcated the work between what fell to the longshoremen and what fell to the Teamsters. And I can go more in depth on that too.
Well, let's go back to the 30s. You mentioned during the 30s there was a lot of labor unrest in the 30s. Let's be honest about that.
Right.
But it sounds like a lot of the issues that occurred in the 30s, which is the height of the Great Depression, they weren't really resolved until that 1960 contract. Were they like simmering that whole time until they were finally addressed? And obviously, you mentioned automation. That was the beginning of the automation age and all that kind of stuff. But did it take that long to figure this out?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, yes. Basically, there were precedents leading up to the Modernization and Mechanization Agreement. One was a 1955 congressional hearing led by Herbert Bonner that looked into labor practices in longshoring. Basically, they wanted to streamline the labor processes and eliminate some of the work rules and practices that the union had built up at the height of their militancy in the 30s, basically in the 30s and 40s. And then there was also a research body that was convened by the Departments of Commerce and Defense that and it was set forth by the National Academy of Sciences National Research Council, basically a research body that carried out studies in longshoring from 1953 to 1963, and it was composed of government officials, military officials, academics, ship owners, stevedore contractors, and longshoremen, and basically they studied ways to reduce bottlenecks in shipping, basically to make shipping more productive. And at the time, containerization was pretty limited in when the Mechanization and Modernization Agreement was first negotiated in 1960. There were only two private sector firms, Sealand and Matson, that engaged in containerization, and at the time, they were only really engaged in intercoastal trade in the U.S. And for Matson, it was they had they basically a near monopoly trade on the Hawaiian Islands, and Sealand had shipments going to and from containerized shipments going to and from Puerto Rico. So it was very much the story of the container was very much a U.S. story in the early years, in the 1960 when this agreement was first negotiated.
You talk about eliminating work rules, and that raised a red flag here because there's always a struggle there because, and we hear this regulatory environment that we're in that that in some cases did become cumbersome. Let's be honest. Sometimes we're overregulated, but they're there for a reason.
Right.
They're there primarily for safety.
Right.
Now, can we be specific on what they were trying to eliminate back then?
Yeah. Basically, they were trying to eliminate first place arrest. So I'll describe what that means. The longshoremen called it first place arrest. The employers called it double handling. Basically, what it was is as longshore workers in break bulk handling would load goods onto a pallet, a winch driver and hatch attendees would use the onboard crane on the ship to move the palletized load from the ship to the dock, and then dock workers on the dock would depalletize the goods, and then when the goods hit the what they called the skin of the dock, when the goods were depalletized and put on the dock, only then could the Teamsters handle the goods. That's why the employers labeled it double handling. They saw it as inefficient.
I see.
And extra work, basically. Called it feather bedding, for another sort of dirty term for it. They also wanted to get rid of sling load limits. In the 1930s, the ILWU secured a sling load limit of 2,100 pounds. And again, as you mentioned, this is primarily for safety. They didn't want limits. They didn't want sling loads that were built beyond the limits because there was a chance of them toppling. The longshoring was very dangerous before mechanization, and then there were also manning requirements. So like the structure of a basic longshore gang was set in the union contract, and the employers wanted to have complete control over manning requirements, basically.
So, were we talking about two unions, or were there more? You mentioned the Teamsters, and of course the longshoremen. They had specific jobs that they had to do, and then you mentioned this agreement in 1960. That had to be, I imagine, contentious at times to make sure that, okay, the Teamsters are going to do this, the longshoremen are going to do this. Explain that part for me.
Yeah. So that work rule, first place arrest, and the skin of the dock demarcated the jurisdictional boundaries between the Teamsters and the ILWU, and this was important because it demarcated what work fell to what union, something the container would basically upend. So when later on, when the use of the container was more widespread, the idea of what union would be able to load the containerized goods onto the truck chassis was sort of an open question.
Mm-hmm.
The longshoremen ultimately got that, but they basically secured all work that was done on the docks fell to longshoremen, and all work that was in the trucks basically fell to the Teamsters. But this tension between who was able to work the contents of the container, the actual physical contents of the container, was a contentious issue, and that boiled up in numerous ways. One in the late 1960s, as I mentioned, the container. The reason, well, let me back up just slightly. The reason the container wasn't widely adopted at first was because there was a lack of standardization. There weren't international standards set until 1970, and the issue of standards would play out throughout the 1960s. Basically, there was issues of how large the container would be, what size it would be, what the corner fittings were, and the structure of the container itself. They ended up going with Corten steel, weathering steel, because it's very it holds its shape. But yeah, basically that.
Jesse, I have another question for you. Our guest is Jesse Halvorsen, independent scholar. We're talking about the longshoremen and their history of militancy. I have to ask you this. You're talking in 1960, they embrace mechanization and automation. Those are tough issues to embrace because when you bring those up, you're talking job losses. And I have to ask you, how, with their history of militancy, were they able to come up with an agreement on that?
Yeah. So that's really interesting. The issue, as I mentioned, the Mechanization and Modernization agreement had like the two parts, basically: the mechanization and modernization. Mechanization dealing with containerization, automation, and longshoring. Mechanization and modernization dealing with work rules and practices. The first part of it, even though job loss was what was a potential issue that the longshoremen would face, they engaged the Pacific Maritime Association in the late 1950s and ironed out some basic ground rules before the Mechanization and Modernization Agreement in 1960. One was that the basic workforce would be preserved from the 1957 number. The subject to normal attrition, of course, so retirements and death, basically, and people leaving the industry on their own accord. They also had the employers agree, and this is the part that really made the union able to sell it to the workers, that they would share in the productivity gains from mechanization. So they established a mechanization fund that the employers would contribute to over the course of the modernization or the Mechanization and Modernization Agreement. And both parties affirmed that they would remove those so-called restrictive work rules and practices. And the PMA and the ILWU agreed that that all these objectives would be accomplished without speed ups, onerous work, or compromised safety.
Mm-hmm.
So the mechanization fund itself was a way that the ILWU leadership was able to sell this to the rank and file, even though it meant job loss. The important part was that the employers agreed to preserve the basic workforce, and so that materialized in a no layoffs guarantee and an hours guarantee to protect the work opportunity for longshore workers.
I get it. So share a little bit in the profits, and we'll sign on the dotted line. I get it. I get it.
Right.
Jesse, I have to take a quick break here. Jesse Halvorsen joining us. He's an independent scholar. We're taking a deep dive into the longshoremen. Now, there was a strike in the early 70s. We're going to talk about that, and we'll fast forward to today and the lessons learned. Back in a few minutes. You're listening to America's Workforce. And remember, you can check us out on at least 5 platforms, including YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Pandora. And when you get an opportunity, here's what you do. Just sign up and receive our shows on a regular basis and give us a rating. We always appreciate those 5-star ratings, so please keep them coming. We're taking another deep dive into history, labor history to be specific. Today, we're looking at the Longshoremen's Union, a very militant and left-led union with a storied history. Our featured guest is Jesse Halvorsen, who's an independent scholar. I want to talk about the strike in 1971 and 1972. They came up with this agreement. You talked about the 30s, what happened in the 30s, 1960, automation, modernization, profit sharing. They're all good things. Why did they go on strike then 10 years later? What happened?
There were a few issues. The Mechanization and Modernization Agreement was renewed in the 1966 bargaining round, and because of the uptick in shipping from the Vietnam War affecting shipping on the West Coast, they actually needed more longshore workers than they anticipated. So the early retirement program that the mechanization paid out induced roughly 2,880 retirements over the course of the first 5 years of the agreement. And given the high levels of retirement, they actually added longshore workers to the roles. And in 1966, they bargained away the wage guarantee, the hours guarantee. So they were keen. And as I mentioned, containerization took a while to become adopted by shippers. There were issues of standardization and issues of the massive fixed capital investments that come with containerization. But basically, they bargained away that guarantee in 1966. They wanted to secure that wage guarantee back because the container was more widespread in the 70s, and it became apparent that there was really affecting work opportunity for the longshore workers. They also wanted jurisdiction over working the contents of the container. And what they did is they took a rule that the ILA, the International Longshore Association, the union that represents longshore workers on the East Coast, Gulf Coast, and Great Lakes, they secured a 50-mile radius rule in their 1968 bargaining round that allowed that gave longshore workers jurisdiction over working the contents of the container as long as it was in a 50-mile radius of the ports. So the ILWU adopted that for their 1971 bargaining round, a way to preserve work opportunity and work the contents of the container. As the president, Harry Bridges, noted in an article for the union newsletter, The Dispatcher, the way they conceived of it is they saw the container as an extension of the hull of the ship. Basically, the contents of the container what they referred to as a hunk of the hatch, and they wanted to be able to work the contents of the container wherever that work was performed to preserve work opportunity for the longshore workers. And the PMA, the Pacific Maritime Association, they wanted their demands also were pretty contentious during this what became the 1971-72 strike. They alone wanted to determine manning for any longshore gangs, with the union able to challenge unsafe or onerous work. They wanted to shore up issues with the steady man portion of the contract, and they wanted to impose qualifications on the ILWU's wage guarantee. And the strike, when it was put to a vote, 9,317 members voted to go on strike, and a mere 343 voted against the action. But curiously enough, the president, Harry Bridges, who famously led the union through the 30s all the way up through the 70s, was actually against the strike, which is sort of interesting.
And how long did the strike last?
The strike lasted for 134 days. It was punctuated by the Nixon administration using the Taft-Hartley injunction, the so-called cooling off period for 80 days. And then the strike resumed, and eventually they came to an agreement. Since they no longer had a mechanization fund with the 1971 contract, they wanted to secure that basically those gains in wages instead of being paid out through a retirement bonus. Yeah, so the Nixon administration punctuated the strike. He used the opportunity to promote what was called the Crippling Strikes Prevention Act, which would have allowed the president to intervene in transportation strikes. But eventually he did issue that injunction. The longshore workers went back on strike after the injunction was done. They secured an hours guarantee. They secured massive wage gains. And they secured the 50-mile radius rule that all longshore work would fall to longshore workers as long as it was within a 50-mile radius of the port.
So they finally got some resolve, and they got back to work. It just took a long strike and obviously presidential action to overcome that. I have to ask you, and I've been following what's been going on recently with the longshoremen. They have two separate contracts, East Coast, West Coast. Did they always have that, to your knowledge?
Yeah. So early on, predating the ILWU, there was something called the union that represented the West Coast Longshore workers was the International Longshore Association's Pacific Coast District, and that was initially affiliated with the union that represents East Coast, Gulf Coast, and Great Lakes workers. It also represented West Coast workers, but in the 30s, they just because of their left leaning orientation, they accepted overtures from John L. Lewis and joined the Congress of Industrial Organizations and left the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. So they split at that point.
So let's talk about the longshoremen today. And I know the ships are huge.
Oh, yeah.
I know there's a whole lot of money that's made by the Maritime Association. They're making tons of money. I'm hearing, tens of thousands of containers.
Yeah.
We had an issue not too long ago dealing with a strike, which didn't last very long. But what happened back then and what is happening today and the lessons learned, can you address that as we wrap this up?
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, the ships today, the large container ships, they can carry approximately 24,000 shipping containers. They're typically over a quarter of a mile long and 190 feet wide. And just to contrast that with when the union negotiated, the first shipment of containers was in 1956 with Malcolm McLean's company Sealand. They had the maiden voyage of the Ideal X, which was a converted T2 tanker, and it transported just 58 shipping containers. So just a small portion of shipping containers in comparison to the 24,000 with the large ships of today. The other unintended consequences were that 50-mile radius that I mentioned, that the work would fall to longshore workers, that was overturned by the NLRB in 1974, and most of the infrastructure for containerization displaced the warehouses and deconsolidation sheds from the areas at ports to areas on the urban fringe. So basically, what that means is the containers, the staging area for containers to stage those 24,000 containers takes up roughly 10 to 20 acres at a shipping berth. So that displaced most of the warehouses from areas that were at the ports to areas in the urban fringe. Modern warehouses and distribution centers are typically 1 million square feet or more and take up to 60 acres. So there's just no room for those modern warehouses at the ports anymore. So that all changed the complete geography of the goods handling infrastructure and had massive implications for work in that most of the work that's performed at warehouses and distribution centers is performed by non-union workers, and in Southern California, at least, roughly 40% of the workforce is staffed by temp agencies. So there's always a constant churn of employees, and makes that sector extremely hard to organize.
I know automation, well, it's not going away. I mean, it started years ago, and I know that was very, very contentious in this last round. And I remember talking to one of the locals here in Northeastern Ohio, the president of the local union, saying, you know what? If they try to unload that ship without a human, we're walking.
Yeah.
We're walking, and that's exactly what happened.
Yeah,
exactly what happened. They're you know what's going on in America right now. They want the cars and trucks to be driverless. Mm-hmm. It's trains. Let's just put one person to drive a 4-mile long train. I mean, this is the world we live in today. But I thank you so much for sharing that little snippet in labor history. One more question before we button it up.
Sure.
Militancy in the longshoremen, is it still there today, in your opinion? I mean, it was radical back in the 30s. What's your take on it today?
Yeah, so that's interesting. There's sort of some people argue that there was a loss of militancy, that like enforcement of the contract and the bureaucratic way of enforcing the contract led to a reduction in led to less militancy. But some people like William Finlay, the sociologist, argue that that just contract enforcement alone is itself a form of militancy, working to the rule. So it's sort of sort of a contentious issue. I mean, yeah, labor conditions are certainly different than they were in the 30s, and the bloodshed and pitched battles that happened between the forces aligned with employers and the forces aligned with workers was very contentious, and some of that bloodshed, that's mostly gone. But I'd say there is still a degree of militancy with longshore workers and workers in general.
Right. Oh, yeah. Because workers are under attack, simply put.
Exactly.
All right, Jesse, thank you for sharing your history of the longshoremen and just talking about a period in history that people need to know about. And that's why we're doing this series. So you take care and stay in touch with us. Okay, brother?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me on your program. Thanks. And thanks for letting me share information about the longshore workers. And thanks to your listeners also.
And that'll be it for another edition of America's Workforce. Coming up on Monday, we're going to talk about the healthcare industry and the high rate of CEO pay, profits over people, plus another edition of Labor 131. Until then, all of you have a safe and wonderful weekend.